It was the year 802. Adelard, the steward of the royal estate at Asnapium near modern-day Aachen, held the new directive in his hands. It was a part of the Capitulare Divilis, a set of rules from the Emperor Charlemagne himself detailing how every imperial property should be managed. For years, Adelard had watched the fields struggle. They would plant wheat year after year in the same soil. The first year's harvest would be good, the second a little less. By the fifth or sixth year, the grain grew thin and pale. The land was tired. The yield from a single seed had dropped from 4 grains back to just 2. It was a slow motion famine. They left some fields fallow, empty, to rest. But it was a desperate, unplanned measure. One field resting meant one less field for food, and the pressure was always on to plant again too soon. The emperor's new rule was different. It was organized. It was a system. Every manor was to be divided into 3 large fields. In the first year, Adelard would direct the peasants to plant the autumn crop, usually wheat or rye, in the first field. In the second field, they would plant a spring crop. This could be oats for the horses or barley for ale, or, and this was the clever part, it could be peas or lentils. The third field would be left completely fallow. It would be plowed but not planted. Livestock would graze on the weeds that grew there, their manure adding richness back to the soil. The next year, everything would shift. The first field, which had the wheat, would now get the spring crop of oats or peas. The second field, the one with the spring crop, would lie fallow. And the third field, now rested and rich from a year of lying fallow, would be ready for the demanding autumn wheat. The rotation would continue, year after year. A 3-year cycle. It seemed so simple, yet it was a profound change. By the 10th century, this system was common across northern Europe. It wasn't just about resting the land anymore. The inclusion of legumes, the peas and beans, actively fed the soil. They pulled something from the sky and put it back into the earth, making it fertile again. It allowed a third more land to be in production at any one time compared to the old 2-field system. It increased the food supply, fed more people, and created a surplus that fueled the growth of towns and markets. It was a foundational shift. People today call it sustainable agriculture. Back then, they just called it farming. And number 10, a hedge is a fence that is alive. In 2003, David Pilcher bought 150 acres of depleted farmland in Lincolnshire, England. The land was a single vast field of packed, lifeless soil. For the past 50 years, it had been farmed intensively for wheat. The old hedgerows, the thick, tangled lines of hawthorn, blackthorn, and hazel that once divided the landscape, had been ripped out in the 1960s to make way for bigger tractors. The government at the time even offered grants for their removal. It was seen as progress. Bigger fields meant more efficiency, more food. The result was a green desert. There were no birds, few insects, and when the wind blew, the topsoil lifted into the air and was gone. David wasn't a conventional farmer. He wanted to raise organic livestock, but he knew the land couldn't support it as it was. His first job wasn't planting grass. It was rebuilding the hedges. Over the next decade, he and his family planted over 3 miles of new hedgerows. They used native species, the same ones that would have grown there for centuries. It was slow, back-breaking work. They planted thousands of small saplings called whips in double rows. They protected them from rabbits with plastic tubes. Neighbors thought he was crazy. He was taking land out of production. He was building fences the hard, expensive way. A wire fence goes up in a week. A hedge takes a decade to mature. But David understood something that had been forgotten. A hedge is more than a fence. As his hedges grew, life returned. First came the insects. Bees and butterflies found nectar in the hawthorn blossoms. Ladybugs and lacewings found a place to live, and they began to control the aphid populations on his land. Then came the birds. Linnets, yellowhammers, and whitethroats, birds whose populations had crashed across the UK, began nesting in the dense, thorny branches. They found shelter from predators and a feast of insects and autumn berries. The hedges acted as wildlife corridors, allowing small mammals to move safely across the landscape. They were also a windbreak. The fierce Lincolnshire winds no longer scoured the topsoil from his fields. The soil behind the hedges was warmer and held more moisture. His grass grew better. The roots of the hedge plants stabilized the soil, preventing erosion. He could even harvest things from them. A few years in, they started coppicing sections for firewood. They gathered slowberries for gin and hazelnuts in the autumn. The hedge was a living part of the farm's ecosystem and its economy. By 2015, his farm was a vibrant, noisy place, a stark contrast to the silent fields surrounding it. He was praised as an innovator in conservation agriculture. This innovation was ancient. Go back to the year 1350. Thomas, a villain on a manor in the same part of England, lived in a world defined by hedges. His family's small holding, a handful of strips in the village's open field, was not marked by wire, but by low earth banks or balks, and sometimes a simple ditch. But the boundaries of the village itself, the edges of the common pasture, and the lanes connecting everything were thick, impenetrable hedgerows. These weren't planted for aesthetic reasons or for wildlife conservation in the modern sense. They were intensely practical. The hedge was the primary form of fencing. It kept Thomas's scrawny cow out of the Lord's wheat and the Lord's deer out of his own cabbage patch. These hedges were a community resource managed under strict manorial law. You couldn't just cut wood from it whenever you wanted. The right to take wood for fuel estover or for repairing tools and fences, bote, was a specific, often hard-won privilege. The wood from the hedge was essential, in a landscape where large forests were often preserved for the Lord's hunting. The hedge was the peasant's main source of firewood to survive the winter. It provided wood for making handles for his tools. The hedge was also a source of food. Thomas's wife Agnes would gather berries from the hawthorn and rose hips to make preserves. The children would collect hazelnuts. They would find mushrooms growing in the damp earth at the hedge's base. The hedge provided materials for repairs, food for the table, and fuel for the fire. It also created a microclimate. The strips of land near the hedge were more protected from the wind, a small but meaningful advantage for a struggling crop. The laws governing these hedges were recorded in the manorial court rolls. We can find records of fines being levied on people like Thomas if their animals broke through a neighbor's hedge, or if they took too much wood without permission. The age of these hedges could be astonishing. A botanist named Max Hooper in the 20th century developed a theory now called Hooper's rule that you can roughly date a hedge by counting the number of woody species in a 30-yard stretch. Each species represents, on average, about 100 years of age. Some of the hedges Thomas would have known were likely already centuries old by 1350, planted by his Anglo-Saxon ancestors. They were part of a continuous, living history written on the landscape. When David Pilcher planted his new hedges in Lincolnshire, he wasn't inventing a new conservation technique. He was rediscovering a multi-purpose medieval technology. Thomas saw a fence, a woodpile, and a pantry. Well, David sees a windbreak, a wildlife corridor, and an erosion control system. The language has changed, but the function is identical. Both men understood that a simple line of shrubs and trees could make the land more resilient, more productive, and more alive. They both knew that a good farm is not an empty factory floor, but a complex, interconnected system. Number 9, pigs belong in the woods. Maria Sanchez stood on the edge of her 80-acre property in the Appalachian foothills of North Carolina in 2011, watching her pigs work. They weren't in a concrete pen or a muddy feedlot. They were moving through a stand of oak and hickory trees, their snouts digging in the leaf litter. Maria ran a small-scale, high-welfare pork operation. She raised a heritage breed, a cross of Tamworth and Berkshire pigs, known for their hardiness and their ability to thrive outdoors. Before buying this land, Maria had worked for a large-scale commercial hog farm. The experience had soured her on the industry. She saw thousands of pigs crammed into metal crates, unable to turn around. They stood on slatted floors, their waste falling into massive pits beneath the buildings. The stench was overwhelming. The pigs were given a constant low dose of antibiotics in their feed just to keep them from getting sick in the crowded, stressful conditions. She quit after 2 years, determined to find another way. Her new way was an old way. She had read about a system called silvopasture, which integrates trees, forage, and livestock. In her case, it meant putting her pigs back in the forest. She divided her woodland into several large paddocks with temporary electric fencing. The pigs would spend a few weeks in one paddock, then she would move them to the next. This rotational system was key. It prevented them from turning the forest floor into a mud pit. The pigs were doing what pigs are designed to do. They were foraging. In the fall, they feasted on acorns and hickory nuts, a diet rich in fats that gave their meat a deep, complex flavor that our customers raved about. They rooted for grubs and tubers, aerating the soil as they went. They cleared out underbrush, reducing the risk of wildfire. Maria still had to provide them with a supplementary grain-based feed, but her feed costs were nearly 40% lower than a comparable confinement operation. The pigs were healthier too. They got plenty of exercise and lived in a low-stress environment. She hadn't needed to use antibiotics once. Her veterinarian bills were a fraction of what a conventional farm would face. For Maria, this was the future of sustainable farming. It was ecologically sound, humane to the animals, and financially viable. She sold her pork directly to consumers in high-end restaurants in Asheville, commanding a premium price for a product that was raised, as she put it, the way nature intended. Hundreds of years earlier, in the Weald of Kent, England, around the year 1120, a man named Edwig would not have called it silvopasture. He would have called it pannage. Pannage was the ancient right of commoners to graze their pigs in the Lord's forest during the autumn. For Edwig, a tenant farmer with a small family and 2 precious pigs, this was not a lifestyle choice. It was a matter of survival. Throughout the year, Edwig's pigs were a nuisance. They were kept in a sty or foraged for scraps around his small cottage. But in the autumn after the harvest was in, the forest became the most important place on the manor. The floor of the great oak and beech woods was littered with acorns and beech mast. This was a massive, free source of high-energy food, perfect for fattening pigs for the winter. This wasn't a free-for-all. The right of pannage was strictly controlled by the manor court. The lord's reeve, or manager, would announce the start of the pannage season, typically from Michaelmas late September to Martinmas mid-November. Edwig would drive his 2 pigs, marked with a specific notch in their ear to identify them as his, to the edge of the woods. He would pay a fee for the privilege. Sometimes it was a small cash payment, but more often it was 1 pig out of every 10, a medieval tax paid in bacon. The reeve would count the pigs as they entered. The value of a forest in medieval England was often not measured by its timber, but by how many pigs it could support. The Domesday Book of 1086, the great survey of England compiled for William the Conqueror, frequently assesses woodlands in this way. And a manor's woods might be described as woodland for 100 swine. This shows how central pannage was to the medieval economy. It was the system that turned the unpalatable nuts of the forest into calorie-dense meat and fat that could be salted and smoked, providing a critical source of protein to get families like Edwig's through the lean winter months. Edwig's pigs, like Maria's, were doing what pigs do best. They were converting a resource that humans couldn't eat directly into valuable food. The rooting in the soil also helped to churn up the ground, making it easier for new tree seedlings to germinate. It was an integrated system, a partnership between humans, animals, and the forest. Edwig didn't think of it in terms of ecosystem services or humane animal husbandry. And he thought of it in terms of the weight of his pigs and the amount of salted pork he could hang in his chimney for the winter. Maria Sanchez, with her electric fences and direct-to-consumer marketing, is practicing a modern version of pannage. She has rediscovered the fundamental logic of the system. A pig's nature is to forage in the woods. By allowing it to do so, you produce better meat at a lower cost with benefits for the animal and the land. For Edwig, it was a customary right essential for survival. For Maria, it's a conscious ecological and ethical choice. The context has changed dramatically, but the wisdom of letting a pig be a pig in the woods remains the same. Number 8, water moves best sideways. In 2008, Mark Shepard stood on his 106-acre farm in Wisconsin and saw a problem. The land sloped. When it rained hard, the water would run straight down the hill, taking his valuable topsoil with it. It would carve little gullies in his fields, which would get bigger every year. In the dry months of summer, the top of the hill would be parched, while the bottom of the property might be waterlogged. He was trying to establish a new kind of farm, one based on perennial crops and trees, a system he called restoration agriculture. But he couldn't do it if he couldn't control the water. His solution was not to install expensive drainage pipes or a high-tech irrigation system. Instead, he used a simple surveying tool and a tractor with a plow. He walked along the contours of his land, marking lines that were perfectly level across the hillside. Then, he drove his tractor along these lines, plowing a specific pattern to create a series of shallow ditches and berms. These were called swales. The concept is simple. A swale is a ditch that is perfectly level. When rain falls on the hillside, it runs down until it hits the swale. Because the swale is level, the water doesn't continue running downhill. It stops, it spreads out evenly along the length of the ditch. And then slowly it soaks into the ground. It's a way of holding the rainwater on the landscape for as long as possible, giving it time to infiltrate the soil and recharge the groundwater. Mark dug dozens of these swales across his property, transforming the hillside into a series of broad, gentle terraces. On the berms, the mounds of earth next to the ditches, he planted trees. He planted chestnut, hazelnut, and apple trees. The water that collected in the swales provided a passive irrigation system for these trees, wicking through the soil to their roots. The trees' roots, in turn, stabilized the soil in the berms, making the whole system stronger. The effect was dramatic. Within a few years, his erosion problems disappeared. His land acted like a sponge. Even after a heavy downpour, there was no muddy runoff leaving his property. The trees he planted grew faster and healthier than they would have on the open slope. The land at the top of the hill stayed moist for longer after a rain. He had effectively drought-proofed his farm using nothing more than gravity, a plow, and a deep understanding of how water moves. Permaculture designers and regenerative farmers now see swales as a key tool for hydrating landscapes and restoring degraded land. This tool is far from new. Travel to the water meadows around Salisbury, England in the year 1650. This is the tail end of the medieval period, but the techniques used here had been developed and refined for centuries. A farmer named John is managing a system of agricultural waterworks that is both simple and genius. He is a droner, and his job is to intentionally flood the meadows next to the River Avon. The meadows were not flat. Over generations, farmers had reshaped them into a precise pattern of ridges and channels, like a giant grassy corduroy. The main river channel had a series of hatches and sluice gates. In the winter around November, John and the other drowners would open certain hatches. This would divert a thin, continuous sheet of river water out of the main channel and into a network of smaller carriers that ran along the top of the ridges. The water would then trickle down the sides of the ridges, a process called floating, and collect in drainage channels at the bottom, which would eventually return the water to the river downstream. The purpose was not to irrigate in the modern sense of watering dry ground. The purpose was to use the river water as a winter blanket. The continuously flowing water, even in the coldest weather, was a few degrees above freezing. It prevented the ground from freezing solid. It protected the roots of the grass from the harsh frost. It also deposited a fine layer of silt and nutrients from the river, fertilizing the meadow for free. In early spring, perhaps late February, John would close the hatches and drain the meadows. The effect was magical. The protected, fertilized grass would start growing weeks earlier than the grass in the surrounding pastures. These water meadows produced an early bite, a flush of lush spring grass that was incredibly valuable. It meant that the ewes and their newborn lambs could be put out to pasture much earlier. It saved precious winter hay stores and ensured the lambs were strong and healthy for the spring markets. The same meadows would then produce a huge crop of hay in the summer. It was a system that could double or even triple the productivity of the land. It was a masterpiece of low-tech, gravity-fed hydraulic engineering. These systems were built and maintained by hand, with shovels and wheelbarrows, and an understanding of water levels that was passed down through generations. Both Mark in Wisconsin and John in Salisbury were water farmers. They were shaping the land to manage the flow of water for agricultural benefit. Mark uses his swales to slow water down and sink it into the ground, a technique ideal for his sloping, rain-fed landscape. And John used his ridges and channels to keep water moving in a thin, constant sheet, a technique perfect for his flat, river-fed landscape. The goals were different. One was for water retention, the other for warmth and fertility science. But the underlying principle was the same. They both recognized that by working with gravity and the contours of the land, you could direct water to create abundance. They moved water sideways, not just letting it run away. And in doing so, they transformed their farms. Number 7. The best fertilizer is a weed. In 2015, Sarah Miller was struggling with her small organic vegetable farm in Vermont. She had 5 acres and the soil was poor. It was rocky and low in organic matter. She was following all the organic rules. She used compost and animal manure, but it was expensive to buy and transport, and she never seemed to have enough. Her yields were low, the carrots were stunted, the kale was pale. She was considering giving up. Then she attended a workshop on soil health. The speaker talked about cover crops and green manure. The idea was to plant a crop not to harvest, but to feed the soil. Instead of leaving her beds bare over the winter, the speaker advised planting something hardy like winter rye or hairy vetch. These plants would cover the soil, protecting it from winter erosion. Their roots would hold the soil in place. That fall, Sarah decided to try it. On the beds where she had just harvested her tomatoes and squash, she sowed a mix of oats and field peas. The crops grew quickly in the cool autumn weather, forming a thick green carpet over the soil. They stayed green for much of the winter. In the spring, before they went to seed, she did something that felt completely wrong. She mowed them down and used a tiller to turn the entire green, living crop back into the soil. She was burying her own plants. A few weeks later, she prepared the beds for her main season cash crops. She noticed a difference immediately. The soil was darker, it was looser, and held more moisture. It was teeming with earthworms. That summer, her vegetables thrived. Her carrot crop was the best she'd ever had. The kale was a deep, healthy green. The peas she had planted were legumes. She learned that they had a special ability. They worked with bacteria in the soil to take nitrogen, an essential plant nutrient, directly from the air and fix it into a form the plants could use. By turning the pea plants into the soil, she was giving her next crop a powerful free dose of nitrogen fertilizer. The oats had produced a huge amount of organic matter, improving the soil structure and its ability to hold water. But Sarah had discovered a new rhythm for her farm. Her fields were never bare. There was always something growing. Either a cash crop for her to sell, or a cover crop to feed the soil. She was farming in a continuous cycle of growing and giving back. It saved her money on fertilizer and made her farm more resilient to drought. She was building her soil, her most valuable asset, season by season. This idea of planting a crop just to plow it under would have been familiar to a Roman farmer 2,000 years ago. Authors like Cato and Columella wrote extensively about the practice of using legumes to enrich the soil. And it was certainly understood by a medieval farmer in Tuscany, Italy, around the year 1250. Let's call him Giovanni. He farms a small plot of land on a hillside, growing wheat for bread and olives for oil. Like Sarah's land, his soil is thin and prone to washing away in the heavy winter rain. The land has been farmed for centuries, and maintaining its fertility is a constant struggle. Manure from his one donkey and a few chickens is not nearly enough. Giovanni practices a form of crop rotation passed down from his father and his father's father. After he harvests his wheat in the summer, he doesn't leave the field bare. He plows it and sows a crop of broad beans or lupins. He's not planning on eating these beans. This is a crop for the earth. The lupins grow through the autumn, their roots break up the compacted soil. Then, in the spring, before he needs to plant his next grain crop, he brings out his donkey and his simple plow. He turns the entire green, flowering lupin crop back into the earth. He doesn't know about nitrogen-fixing bacteria. He has no concept of atmospheric nitrogen. But he knows from generations of observation that this practice works. He knows that the field where he plows in the sovesio, as the practice is called in Italian, will produce a better wheat crop the following year. He knows the soil will be richer and darker. It is part of the deep practical knowledge of farming. The church taught that God provided the sun and the rain, but it was the farmer's job to maintain the grassa, the fatness of the land. Plowing in a green manure crop was a key way to do this. In some medieval texts, you can find specific advice on this. The 14th century writer Pietro de Crescenzi wrote a detailed agricultural manual, the Ruralia Commoda, which was widely copied and read. He explicitly recommended plowing in beans, vetch, and lupins to enrich the soil, especially for growing grapes and other valuable crops. This wasn't some obscure practice. It was considered the mark of a good, knowledgeable farmer. When Sarah Miller planted her cover crop of oats and peas, she was participating in a tradition that stretches back millennia. Giovanni used a donkey and a wooden plow. Sarah uses a tractor and a mower. Sarah understands the microbiology of nitrogen fixation. Giovanni understood it as the inherent virtue of certain plants to restore the land's fatness, but the act itself is unchanged, planting a crop not to take from the soil, but to give back to it. They both learned that sometimes the most valuable thing you can grow is something you never harvest. The best fertilizer is not something you buy in a bag, but something you grow yourself, a weed you plant on purpose. Number 6, a farm should have animals, even if you don't sell them. In 2010, Ben Hartman and his wife Rachel took over a small half-acre farm in Indiana. Their goal was to grow vegetables for their local community and make a decent living doing it. They became experts in efficiency, focusing on high-value crops and intensive planting methods. They were successful, but Ben noticed a problem. He was constantly struggling to maintain the fertility of his soil. He was a vegetable farmer, not a livestock farmer. He was trucking in huge amounts of compost and manure to feed his soil. It was expensive, labor-intensive, and it felt like there was a missing piece in his farm's ecosystem. So he decided to get some animals. He didn't get a lot. He started with a small flock of chickens, about 20 of them. He wasn't planning on selling eggs or meat commercially. The chickens had a different job. He built a portable coop, a chicken tractor, and moved them around his vegetable plots. After he harvested a bed of lettuce, he would move the chickens onto it. They would scratch and peck, eating leftover plant debris and weed seeds. They would hunt for pests like slugs and grasshoppers, and most importantly, they would poop. Their manure, rich in nitrogen, was deposited directly onto the soil where it was needed most. They were his mobile cleanup and fertilization crew. A couple years later, he added 2 pigs. Again, not for commercial sale, but for a specific task. He had a section of his property that was overgrown with weeds and sod that he wanted to turn into a new growing area. Instead of using a tractor and a rototiller, which would burn fossil fuels and could damage the soil structure, he fenced in the area and put the pigs on it. For a few months, the pigs did what pigs do best. They rooted and dug. They turned over the sod with their snouts, eating the roots and grubs. By the time they were done, the area was completely tilled, aerated, and fertilized. It was ready for planting. Ben had integrated livestock into his vegetable farm, not as a primary product, but as a key part of the farm's operating system. The animals converted things he couldn't use: weeds, pests, leftover crops, into things he desperately needed: fertility and tillage. They replaced the work of machines and the need for purchased inputs. They closed a loop on his farm, making it more self-sufficient and resilient. Modern regenerative agriculture calls this animal integration. Now, let's go back to a typical peasant farm in Normandy, France, around the year 1300. Jean and his family work a small plot of land, about 15 acres. They grow wheat, oats, and some vegetables in a garden plot. They are, by definition, crop farmers, but their farm would be unimaginable without animals. They have 1 ox. This is their most valuable possession. The ox is their tractor. It pulls the heavy plow through the soil, a job impossible for a human to do alone. The ox is the engine of their farm. They are not in the business of selling oxen. They might raise a calf every few years to sell at the market, but the primary purpose of the ox is to provide draft power. They also have a cow. The cow provides milk, which gives them cheese and butter. This is a crucial source of fat and protein in their diet. The cow is their dairy. Again, they are not commercial dairy farmers. The milk is for their own subsistence. More importantly, every single day, Jean's children are tasked with collecting the manure from the byre where the ox and cow sleep. This manure is carefully piled up, mixed with straw and other waste, and left to rot down. In the spring, it will be laboriously carted out to the fields and spread before plowing. This is their only source of fertilizer. Without the animals' manure, the fields would quickly become exhausted and the family would starve. The fertility of the fields and the lives of the animals are completely intertwined. They also have a few chickens scratching around the yard. The chickens eat scraps, insects, and spilled grain. They provide a few eggs, a rare and valuable treat. They are the farm's pest control and waste disposal unit. They might have a single pig, which is fattened on household scraps and whatever it can forage. The pig is the ultimate recycler, turning waste into valuable meat for the winter. For Jean, there was no separation between crop farming and livestock farming. It was all just one thing: farming. The animals were not an optional extra. They were essential cogs in the machine. Each animal had a specific job, or more accurately, several jobs. The ox provided power. The cow provided food and fertility. The chickens provided eggs and pest control. The pig was the savings account. This was a closed-loop system born of necessity. Nothing was wasted. The crops fed the people, and the animals. The animals provided the power and fertility to grow the crops. When Ben Hartman brought a few chickens and pigs onto his modern vegetable farm, he was not inventing a new clever system. He was rediscovering the fundamental logic of the pre-industrial farm. He was rebuilding the kind of integrated system that Jean from Normandy would have found completely normal. The modern trend of specialization, where a farm grows only corn or only raises chickens, is the historical anomaly. For most of human history, a farm without animals was not really a farm at all. Number 5. The earth should not be naked. In 1994, Gabe Brown took over his father-in-law's 1,760-acre farm near Bismarck, North Dakota. For the first few years, he farmed conventionally. He practiced tillage, plowing his fields every year before planting. After harvest, the fields were left bare and brown all winter, exposed to the harsh North Dakota winds. He used synthetic fertilizers to feed his crops and herbicides to kill the weeds. It was how everyone around him farmed. It was what he had been taught. Then a series of disasters hit. 4 years in a row, from 1995 to 1998, his crops were wiped out by hail or drought, and he was on the verge of bankruptcy. He knew he had to change something, or he would lose the farm. He started reading and attending conferences, learning about a different way of farming called no-till. The basic idea of no-till is to disturb the soil as little as possible. Instead of plowing the fields, a special planter cuts a tiny slit in the soil, drops in the seed, and closes the slit. The soil structure is left intact. Gabe decided to try it. The first few years were difficult. His yields were lower than his neighbors. But he persisted. He soon realized that no-till was just the first step. The real key was to keep the soil covered at all times. He started planting cover crops, just like Sarah Miller in Vermont. But he took it a step further. He started planting diverse cocktails of cover crops, mixing a dozen or more different species of grasses, legumes, and broadleaf plants together. After he harvested his cash crop like corn or wheat, he would immediately plant one of these cocktail mixes. His fields were no longer brown. In the winter, they were green. The cover crops protected the soil from erosion. But they did much more than that. The diverse root systems of the different plants created channels in the soil, improving water infiltration. When it rained, the water soaked in instead of running off. The legumes fixed nitrogen. The broadleaf plants, like radishes, had deep taproots that broke up compacted soil layers. When these crops died, they decomposed, adding a huge amount of organic matter to the soil. Within a decade, Gabe's farm was transformed, and his soil, which had been hard, compacted, and pale, was now dark, crumbly, and teeming with life. The organic matter content in his soil increased from less than 2% to over 6%, a staggering improvement. His soil acted like a massive sponge, holding vast amounts of water. He became much more resilient to drought. He had completely stopped using synthetic fertilizers. The cover crops and a healthy soil ecosystem provided all the nutrients his crops needed. He rarely needed to use herbicides because the thick mat of cover crops and crop residue on the soil surface suppressed the weeds. He had transitioned his farm into a thriving, profitable, and ecologically sound operation. His core principle was simple armor: the soil. The earth should never be naked. This principle would have been deeply familiar to a farmer in the mountainous region of the Alps around the year 1400. Let's call her Katerina. She and her family farm on a steep slope. Her biggest enemy is not drought, but gravity and water. A single heavy thunderstorm can wash away a generation's worth of precious, thin topsoil. Leaving the soil bare on these slopes would be suicidal. Katerina's family practices a system of terracing, which has been in place for centuries. The stone walls they maintain are a form of permanent erosion control, but the management of the soil on those terraces is just as important. The ground is almost never left bare. In the small plots where they grow rye or barley, the stubble is left in the field after harvest. It is not plowed under immediately. The stubble helps to hold the soil in place against the autumn rains. As soon as one crop is harvested, another is often sown. They might undersow a crop of clover or other hardy legumes into their grain crop. When the grain is harvested, the clover is already established, providing a continuous living cover. The most important part of her family's land is the hay meadow. These meadows are a permanent polyculture of grasses and wildflowers. They are never plowed. The dense, permanent mat of roots holds the fragile mountain soil together like a net. The meadow is harvested for hay in the summer to feed their single cow through the long winter. The cow is then grazed on the meadow in the autumn, adding manure to fertilize it. The soil of the meadow is never, ever exposed. It is a permanent, living skin on the mountainside. The very idea of large-scale, deep plowing that inverts the soil and leaves it bare was not common in many parts of medieval Europe. The heavy moldboard plow, which could do this, was a technology best suited for the heavy wet clay soils of the northern European plains. In many other regions, farmers used a simpler, lighter ard or scratch plow. This tool would cut a furrow in the soil, but did not turn it over completely. It left much of the crop residue and surface vegetation in place. It was a form of minimum tillage, born of technological limitation, but with the ecological benefit of keeping the soil covered. When Gabe Brown decided to stop plowing and keep his soil covered with a permanent mat of living plants or crop residue, he was breaking with the conventions of modern industrial agriculture. But he was also reconnecting with a much older, more fundamental agricultural wisdom. Katerina, on her steep alpine terrace, knew that bare soil is vulnerable soil. She knew that a living cover of plants was the only thing standing between her family and ruin. Gabe Brown, with his modern no-till drills and complex cover crop cocktails, has used science to rediscover this ancient truth. The technology is different, but the principle is identical. A covered soil is a healthy, stable, and productive soil. Number 4, pests are a sign of imbalance. In 2012, Jamie Thompson was running a 3-acre organic farm in California's Central Valley. His biggest challenge was pests. One year, his kale crop was decimated by aphids. They coated the leaves in a sticky black mess, making them unsellable. He followed the organic rules and sprayed with an approved soap-based insecticide, but it was a constant, expensive battle. The aphids always came back. The next year, an infestation of cabbage moths destroyed his broccoli. It felt like he was always fighting a new war against a new insect. Frustrated, he started to look beyond simple sprays. He read about a concept called integrated pest management, or IPM. The idea was not to annihilate every pest, but to create a farm ecosystem where pest populations were kept in check by their natural predators. It was about creating balance, not waging war. Jamie decided to change his farm's layout. Instead of planting his kale in one large block, he started interplanting it with other crops. He planted rows of cilantro and dill among his brassicas. He learned that the tiny flowers of these herbs were a favorite food source for hoverflies and parasitic wasps. The adult wasps would sip the nectar, and then they would lay their eggs inside the cabbage moth caterpillars, killing them from within. The hoverfly larvae were voracious predators of aphids. He also planted a border of flowers, like alyssum and yarrow, around the edges of his fields. These insectary strips provided a permanent habitat for beneficial insects. He built a small pond to attract dragonflies, which eat mosquitoes and other flying pests. He put up a beetle bank, a raised strip of land planted with native grasses to provide a home for predatory ground beetles. The results weren't immediate, but over the next 2 years, his farm changed. He still had aphids, but he no longer had massive destructive outbreaks. He would see the aphids on his kale, but he would also see the ladybugs and hoverfly larvae eating them. He would find cabbage moth caterpillars, but many of them would have the telltale signs of being parasitized by wasps. He had created a complex food web where the predators and the prey were in a dynamic balance. He was spending far less time and money on pest control. By making his farm a welcoming home for good bugs, he had largely solved his bod bug problem. He had stopped trying to kill the pests and had instead focused on creating a system that controlled them for him. This way of thinking would have made perfect sense to a medieval monastery gardener. Let's travel to the Abbey of St. Gall in what is now Switzerland around the year 820. We have a detailed plan of this ideal monastery, which includes several gardens. Brother Benedict is in charge of the physic garden, where the monks grow medicinal herbs. Brother Benedict's garden is not a monoculture. It is a complex, diverse planting. In one bed, he has fennel growing next to his cabbages. He doesn't know the specific chemical compounds, but he has observed that the strong scent of the fennel seems to confuse the white butterflies that lay their eggs on the cabbage leaves. He has rosemary and sage planted among his beans, and he has noticed that there are fewer black bean aphids in these areas. This is companion planting, a system built on generations of careful observation. The monastery garden is also part of a larger integrated system. The abbey keeps bees. The bees pollinate the fruit trees and the vegetables in the garden, but they also pollinate the wildflowers in the surrounding meadows and woods. The monks encourage birds to nest near the gardens by leaving some areas of hedge untrimmed. They know that the tits and wrens are tireless hunters of caterpillars and other small insects. They have a fish pond, which provides food for the monks on Fridays, but it also attracts frogs and toads, which eat slugs and snails, a major pest in their damp climate. Brother Benedict does not think in terms of integrated pest management. He thinks in terms of a divinely ordered creation. He believes that every creature, even the lowly beetle and the bothersome caterpillar, has a place in God's plan. His job as a gardener is not to eradicate, but to tend. Tending means fostering a harmonious balance. A destructive outbreak of pests would be seen not as a simple problem to be solved with a poison, but as a sign of some deeper imbalance in the garden and perhaps even as a reflection of a spiritual failing. The monks of St. Gall compiled their knowledge in manuscripts. They recorded which plants grew well together and which did not. They passed on observations about what plants seemed to repel certain pests. This was a slow accumulated science based on trial and error over centuries. They didn't have the tools of modern entomology, but they had the most powerful tool of all patient observation of the interconnectedness of the living world. When Jamie Thompson planted flowers to attract predatory wasps, he was, in essence, recreating the logic of Brother Benedict's garden. Both of them understood that a farm or a garden is not a sterile laboratory. It is a complex, living community. The modern approach of sterile monocultures and chemical warfare against pests is a historical aberration. For most of history, farmers and gardeners knew that the best way to deal with pests was to encourage their enemies. They knew that a healthy, diverse system is a resilient system, one that can largely regulate itself. Number 3, not every seed is a good seed. In 2006, Will Bonsall was walking through his garden in rural Maine, carefully inspecting his tomato plants, but he wasn't looking for ripe fruit. He was looking for the best plants. He was a seed saver, part of a small but growing movement to preserve agricultural biodiversity. The vast majority of farmers in the U.S. buy new seeds every year from a handful of large corporations. These seeds are typically hybrids designed for uniformity and high yields under ideal, chemically supported conditions. They are not designed for saving. The seeds from a hybrid plant will not grow true to type the next year. Will was doing the opposite. He was growing hundreds of varieties of heirloom or open pollinated plants. These were older varieties, some of which had been passed down through families for generations. His main work was not growing food to sell, but growing plants to save their seeds. He would walk his rows and identify the individual plant that showed the best traits. Perhaps it was a tomato plant that set fruit earlier in Maine's short growing season, or a bean plant that showed the most resistance to a common fungal disease, or a squash that had the best flavor and stored the longest through the winter. And he would tie a ribbon around that specific plant. That would be the one he would save the seeds from. The rest of the crop he could eat or give away, but the seeds from that one superior plant were his gold. He would carefully harvest them, clean them, and store them. The next year, he would plant those seeds. Over many years of this process called selective breeding, he was adapting these varieties to his specific microclimate and his specific needs. He was creating a strain of tomato that was uniquely suited to his farm in Maine. He was participating in the slow, patient work of coevolution between humans and plants. Will saw this as a vital act of resilience. By preserving this genetic diversity, he was keeping options open for the future. If a new disease came along that wiped out the common commercial tomato varieties, the resistance might be found in one of the hundreds of old varieties he was keeping alive. He was maintaining a living library of genetic information. This process would have been completely normal for a farmer anywhere in the world before the 20th century. Let's imagine a farming village in the Andes Mountains of Peru around the year 1450 during the time of the Inca Empire, and a woman named Koya is in charge of managing her family's supply of potatoes. Koya's family doesn't grow just one kind of potato. They grow dozens. On their small terrace plots at different elevations, they have potatoes of all shapes, sizes, and colors. There are small purple potatoes that grow well in the highest, coldest plots. There are larger yellow potatoes that thrive in the richer soil of the lower terraces. There are some potatoes that are good for boiling, others that are best for freeze drying into a preserved food called chuno. This diversity is their insurance policy. In a year with a late frost, the purple potatoes might survive when the yellow ones fail. In a dry year, one variety might prove more drought tolerant than the others. Planting a monoculture of a single potato variety would be considered dangerously foolish. Every year at harvest time, Koya performs the most important job. As the potatoes are dug up, she sorts them. The largest, healthiest, most perfect potatoes are not the ones that will be eaten first. Those are the seed potatoes. They are set aside, carefully stored in a cool, dark place to be planted the following year. The small or damaged potatoes are the ones used for the family's daily meals. I think this is the exact opposite of what a modern consumer does. Who eats the best and throws away the worst? Koya is a plant breeder, though she would not use that term. By always selecting the best potatoes from her own harvest to replant, she and her ancestors have, over centuries, developed varieties that are perfectly adapted to their specific valley. Their potatoes are a unique genetic heritage, a product of that specific soil, that specific climate, and the specific needs of her people. The Incas were masters of this. They took a single plant native to the region and, through this patient process of selection, developed over 3,000 different varieties of potato. This was the standard agricultural practice across the world. A medieval English peasant would save the plumpest ears of his wheat to use for seed. An Italian farmer would save seeds from the tomato plant that had the best flavor and resisted blossom and rot. The seeds were part of the farm's wealth, a living inheritance passed down from one generation to the next. They were selected for resilience, flavor, and suitability to local conditions, not just for raw yield or shipping durability. When Will Bonsall ties a ribbon around his best tomato plant in Maine, he is practicing the same fundamental art as Koya sorting her potatoes in the Andes. They are both active participants in the dance of evolution, guiding the development of their crops to fit their world. The modern industrial seed system, with its hybrids and patents, has broken this ancient relationship. The seed saver movement is an attempt to repair it, to put the power of genetic stewardship back into the hands of the farmer, where it had been for 10,000 years. Number 2, the best soil is built, not found. In 2001, John Peterson, a farmer in southern Illinois, was looking at his balance sheets, and he didn't like what he saw. The cost of fertilizer, particularly nitrogen, was going up every year. His farm was on land that had been growing corn and soybeans continuously for decades. The soil was depleted. The only way he could get a decent yield was by applying hundreds of pounds of synthetic nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium per acre. He was essentially practicing hydroponics in dirt. The soil was little more than a dead medium to hold up the plants. He started to experiment with a different approach. He had read about the importance of soil biology, about the trillions of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that make up a healthy soil food web. These organisms are not pests, they are the engine that drives nutrient cycling. But decades of tillage and chemical applications on his farm had decimated them. John decided his main job was no longer to feed the plant, but to feed the soil. He started by adding a third crop to his corn and soybean rotation, winter wheat. This meant the soil was covered for more of the year. More importantly, after the wheat, he started planting a complex cover crop mix similar to what Gabe Brown was doing in North Dakota. He included legumes like clover and vetch to fix nitrogen, and deep-rooted plants like radishes to break up compaction. He also brought animals back onto his cropland. After the cover crops had grown for a couple of months, he would graze cattle on them. The cattle ate the forage, and in return, they spread their manure and urine all over the field. This was a massive injection of organic matter and microbial life back into the soil. But the most radical change he made was starting to make his own compost on a large scale. He collected waste from his farm crop residue, animal bedding, spoiled hay, and mixed it with manure. He managed these piles carefully, turning them to keep them aerated and monitoring their temperature. After a few months, he had a dark, rich, sweet-smelling compost teeming with beneficial microbes. He invested in a spreader and began applying a thin layer of this compost to his fields. His neighbors thought he was insane. He was spending time and money on things that didn't provide an immediate cash return. But over the next decade, John's soil began to change. The organic matter content doubled. The soil structure improved, and it could hold much more water. He started to reduce his fertilizer use, first by 30%, then by 50% by 2015. On some of his fields, he was no longer using any synthetic nitrogen at all. The biological activity in his soil, fueled by the cover crops, manure, and compost, was providing the nutrients his crops needed. He was building soil. He had turned a dead, inert substance back into a living, functioning ecosystem. This idea of building soil from scratch would have been understood in one of the most unlikely farming environments in the world, the Amazon rainforest. For a long time, archaeologists believed the Amazon was a pristine wilderness and that its notoriously poor acidic soils could never have supported large, settled populations. But in recent decades, the discovery has turned that idea on its head. All across the Amazon basin, there are large patches of incredibly fertile dark black earth. This soil, called Terra Preta do Indio, the Indian black earth, is not natural. It was created by people. Starting around 2,000 years ago, pre-Columbian peoples in the Amazon developed a remarkable system of soil manufacturing. An indigenous farmer, let's call her Yema, living in a village along the Amazon River around the year 1000, would have been a soil builder. Her village would have a designated area for waste. Into this midden pile would go everything: food, scraps, fish bones, animal manure, human waste, and crucially, large amounts of charcoal from cooking fires. This charcoal, now called biochar, is the key ingredient of Terra Preta. The charcoal is a very stable form of carbon. It doesn't break down easily. Its most important property is its incredible porosity. A tiny piece of charcoal is riddled with microscopic nooks and crannies. This structure provides a perfect habitat for soil microorganisms. It's like a coral reef for bacteria and fungi. It also helps the soil retain nutrients and water. Yema and her community would continuously add layers of charcoal, ash, and organic waste to these piles. Over time, this would create a deep, incredibly fertile soil. They would then use this manufactured soil in their gardens and fields to grow their crops of cassava, maize, and squash. These Terra Preta soils are so stable and fertile that even today, 1,000 years after they were created, they are still sought after by local farmers. They remain far more productive than the surrounding red jungle soils. The people who made Terra Preta were not just farmers, they were soil engineers. They took a poor, infertile soil and, through the systematic addition of organic matter and charcoal, transformed it into a rich, self-sustaining agricultural resource. When John Peterson in Illinois makes his large-scale compost piles and focuses on feeding his soil biology, he is practicing a modern version of what Yema did in the Amazon. Yema used charcoal and household waste. John uses cover crops and composted manure, but the principle is identical. They both recognize that fertile soil is not something you simply find. It is something you must actively and patiently build. They understood that you don't just farm the land, you create it. Number one, the land needs to breathe. The story of modern environmental farming begins where the story began, with the three-field system of crop rotation that became widespread in medieval Europe. But the principle behind it is more fundamental than just a 3-year cycle. It's the idea that you cannot take from the soil continuously without giving it time and a way to recover. It's the idea that the land, like a living thing, needs to breathe. Let's go back to Adelard, the steward on Charlemagne's estate in 802. Before the 3-field system, the common practice was a 2-field system. Half the land was planted with a crop, and the other half was left fallow, unplanted for a year. The next year, they would switch. It was a system of 1 year of work, 1 year of rest. The problem was that a single year of rest often wasn't enough to fully restore the soil's fertility. And with half the land out of production every year, it was difficult to feed a growing population. The pressure was always on to shorten the fallow period, to plant on the tired land, which only made the problem of declining yields worse. The genius of the 3-field system was twofold. First, by dividing the land into 3, it actually increased the amount of land in production at any one time from 1/2 to 2/3. This was a major boost to food security. Second, and more importantly for the health of the land, it introduced a more sophisticated way of resting. The fallow field, the one with nothing planted in it, was not simply abandoned. It was plowed 2 or 3 times during the year. This helped to control weeds, and crucially, it was used for grazing the village's livestock. The animals would eat the weeds and volunteer plants, and their manure would be deposited directly onto the soil. The fallow year was an active period of restoration, not just a passive rest. The other revolutionary part was the introduction of the second planting in the spring, which often included legumes like peas, beans, and lentils. A medieval farmer, let's call him Odo, farming under this system in northern France in the year 1100 would not have known about nitrogen-fixing rhizobia bacteria. But he would have known through pure, hard-won experience that a crop of wheat grew better in a field that had previously grown peas than in a field that had previously grown oats. This practical knowledge was profound. He was participating in a system that didn't just rest the land, but actively healed and enriched it. The rotation of a heavy feeding grain crop wheat, a lighter feeding or soil building crop peas or beans, and a fallow year for grazing created a sustainable cycle. It was a system that could be maintained for centuries without a dramatic decline in soil fertility. It built a resilience into the agricultural landscape that supported the growth of European civilization. Now, let's jump forward to 2018. Anna McClung is a young farmer in Iowa. She is surrounded by a sea of corn and soybeans. The dominant agricultural system in her region is a simple 2-crop rotation. Corn 1 year, soybeans the next. There is no fallow period. There are no other crops. The land is never allowed to rest. Anna saw the consequences. The soil was degrading. Water quality in the local streams was poor due to fertilizer and chemical runoff. The system was incredibly productive in terms of sheer bushels per acre, but it was brittle. It was completely dependent on massive inputs of synthetic fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides. It was a system on a chemical life support machine. Anna decided to farm differently on her 300 acres. She reintroduced the idea of a more complex rotation. She went beyond the simple corn and soy system. She added a 3rd crop to her rotation, a small grain like oats or rye. After the small grain was harvested in the summer, she would have a long window to plant a multi-species cover crop, which would grow all fall and protect the soil all winter. So her rotation looked more like this: year 1 corn, year 2 soybeans, year 3 oats, followed by a cover crop. She had, in effect, recreated a modern version of the 3-field system. 2 years of cash crops and a 3rd year that was focused on soil building and rest. Her neighbors were skeptical. Oats were not as profitable as corn or soybeans, but Anna was looking at a different balance sheet. By introducing the 3rd crop and the cover crop, she was breaking up pest and disease cycles. She was adding organic matter to her soil. The legumes in her cover crop mix were fixing nitrogen, allowing her to cut back on the amount of fertilizer she needed to buy for her corn crop. Her soil's ability to absorb water improved, making her more resilient in both wet and dry years. She was earning less on that 3rd year, but her costs for the other 2 years were going down. Her farm was becoming more resilient and, over the long term, more profitable. Anna McClung, with her university education in agronomy, understood the science behind what she was doing. She could measure the increase in soil organic matter and quantify the amount of nitrogen fixed by her cover crops. Odo, the medieval farmer, could not. His knowledge was traditional and observational, but both of them were operating on the same fundamental principle. You cannot ask the land to give and give and give without a period of recovery and restoration. Whether you call it a fallow year with grazing animals or a soil building year with a multi-species cover crop, the concept is the same. The land needs to breathe. This ancient medieval insight that a resilient food system requires a rhythm of work and rest, of taking and of giving, is the same insight that is now at the forefront of the movement to create a truly sustainable agriculture for the future.